How do we as ordinary citizens build a sustainable social order in South Africa, especially in the context of a state which is failing to maintain its basic duties and obligations towards us as citizens? Well, joining me to discuss this question is Russell Lamberti. He's an economist with the business advocacy group Sakeliga. Russell Lamberti, welcome to Solutions with David Ansara.
Thanks, Dave. It's a real pleasure to be with you. I've enjoyed your show in the past, and I'm looking forward to a great conversation.
Great, Russell. Well, let's first start off by surveying the landscape in South Africa at the moment. I think the last 10 years in particular have seen the capacity of the state and governance really deteriorate in the country. And this is manifesting many social and economic problems. You're an economist by training and by profession. But what do you see happening in South Africa? Because there seems to be quite widespread disaggregation and breakdown occurring in our society.
Yeah, Dave, that's absolutely true. I mean, South Africa, not exclusively in the world, but South Africa is certainly in a real pickle, facing enormous challenges, and I think facing a breakdown of order. That's not controversial. That's on display very much, in most places where you go in South Africa, and of course came to a head in the most sort of shocking way in July in KwaZulu-Natal, where we saw just a complete breakdown of civil and social order, causing hundreds of billions of rands worth of damage, wrecking towns, and of course leading to loss of life and all sorts of awful things. So just a terrible manifestation of what's been really brewing, I think, for several decades, and certainly the last 10 to 15 years of mismanagement and so on in South Africa. I suppose there's several layers of problem in South Africa that would take us maybe a few episodes to get through. So we don't have to kind of do huge deep dives into all of that. I think at the most superficial level, you've got badly managed state, a state infrastructure that's been deprofessionalized and run as a kind of jobs for pals, cadre deployment sort of crony system. And so you've deprofessionalized the civil service in a country where it was always going to be difficult to have an effective civil service when, and this is sort of the next level of problem, when you have a very centralized government structure on top of a very large and very complex country. Complex because of its size, complex because of its different people groups, its different languages, its different cultures, and so on. So that that bureaucratic challenge was always going to be there. And so it was always absolutely critical that South Africa, that the bureaucracy, that the state infrastructure to make the unitary South Africa have some semblance of functionality had to be a meritocracy, had to be very professional. And that's what that required in the changeover was a far longer period of training for civil servants coming in. And instead, what we've gotten is, unfortunately, sort of very rapid. What we got was a rapid replacement of the old civil service, replaced by not only a new and inexperienced civil service, but then one that came to be increasingly deployed on the basis of favors and cronyism and so on. So that's a huge problem. And then I think at sort of a very fundamental level, South Africa as a unitary state, and this is maybe a point that we might have sort of culminated towards the end of the discussion, but we can sort of front load it a little bit. South Africa as a unitary state has always faced enormous challenges, from union in 1910 through to the apartheid era, through to the post-1994 era. This unitary experiment has been going pretty poorly, I would say, overall. It's had its moments, but by and large, it's never really worked at any one time for everyone in the country. There's always been a fairly large set of winners and losers, and there's important political and sort of social reasons for that, which we can get into. So on several levels, we've got this kind of state failure. But last thing I want to say about this particular point is that we must understand, and I think this is really critical, and I think this is a critical issue for the world right now, is that the state and its functions are not what constitute social order. The state and its functions are a subset of this broader idea of social order. And really, when you think about this and you think about the nature of states and the nature of communities and the nature of civil society organizations, and if you like, the fabric of society that constitutes the social order, you start to realize that the state is actually quite a small portion of this broader thing that we call social order. And that when the state starts to assume more and more functions of social order, you necessarily gravitate towards disorder. So the state actually doesn't have the capacity and was never designed to be able to fill out this whole space of social order. It was always an administrative function that administered an already existing society, a society that had structures of order, that had commercial order already. Now, government comes in and it provides, in a good case scenario, a very useful administrative, sort of juridical, justice function and potentially protective function, security function. But that is a service that is offered to a society that has broad mechanisms of order outside of the state. And in a totalitarian era, as it were, and with a government that thinks increasingly that all of society and all decisions must be pulled toward itself, it starts assuming more and more of the function of order. And what you see at a local and lower level is disintegration of the old traditional social mechanisms of order as they get subsumed into the sort of central state mandate. And that, I think, in South Africa's case, and it's as I said again, it's actually a global issue, is leading us to a place of increasing disorder that we struggle to put our finger on. But it's largely because at these more local levels, I think we're seeing a loss of civil society infrastructure, as it were. And that's partly got to do with the centralizing tendency of the state, excessive taxation, excessive regulation, regulating commerce, regulating how you can have a school, how you can do this and that and the next thing. That all gets sucked into the state, and it's not a mechanism of order. It's actually a mechanism of disorder. And that's the paradox of state growth, is that state growth looks like it's providing order to a society, but if it's coming at the expense of non-state mechanisms of order, then it's a disorderly trend.
Right, Russell. So we have the administrative state, which is the functions of administering security, other civil functions, and then there's also the nation state, which is the conception of the idea of the country. And so, as you've suggested, the administrative state has become bloated, overly centralized, and is now crowding out civil society to the detriment of many aspects of our social order. But then there's also this idea of the nation state, of the idea of South Africa. And you've alluded there to the fact that this concept of the unitary South Africa is perhaps under strain. Do you care to elaborate on some of those ideas?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that when you think of a unitary state, I think the first thing to say is that, it's very important that one recognizes that there's several forms and several degrees of centralization that a unitary state or nation state, as it were, can take. So the United States of America is strictly a unitary state, but it has this, very strongly embedded federal structure, a federal and decentralized structure, which when you look at, for example, how America has managed the COVID pandemic, it's just been really fascinating. Whatever your opinions on the various actions are, what's been fascinating to see is how 50 states within America have been able to do 50 different experiments on COVID policy. And within those states, you've had multiple experiments at county and city level and so on, with various mandates and all the rest of it. So it's really kind of this system of decentralization under a unitary state called the United States of America. The United Kingdom is a lot more centralized, and you get a lot more centralized governments in Europe. Germany is a bit more federal. So there's all kinds of ways that a unitary state can function from a centralization perspective. South Africa, in writing in the constitution, appears to be quite decentralized and quite federal. But in practice, de facto, it struggles to really achieve the kinds of decentralization that was envisaged by some signatories and some crafters of that constitution. And in effect, South Africa is actually a very centralized order. And what you find is that the provinces have fairly limited autonomy, certainly find it extremely difficult to raise revenue, autonomously. And the same is true at a municipal level, though municipalities do have, several functions that they can administer and so on. In practice, we see a huge amount of dominance from the center in South Africa, and a difficulty in governing at a kind of local level for various reasons. So that's what I would say. Now let me just say quickly that I think the rule of thumb here, Dave, is something like this for me. The size, the cultural diversity, and the complexity of a particular country is roughly going to determine how much decentralization that governance system requires. So, if we take a place like Denmark, it's a pretty culturally very homogenous society. It speaks basically one language. It's a pretty small place. I think Denmark's population is probably around 5 million or so. It's an isolated little island, very homogenous, fairly uncomplex as far as countries and societies go. And what you'll find in a place like Denmark, and I'm not an expert on the depths of their political structure, but you're going to find the ability to have a fair degree of centralization, and even the ability to tolerate a degree of kind of socialism and quite heavy social democracy or welfarism. You get other countries that are very different from that. South Africa is one of them. Brazil is another one. Very, very large geography. Now, large geography doesn't always mean significant complexity. Very sparsely populated countries might not be particularly complex, even though they're large. But you're talking, many, many, many millions, a few 100 million people in a place like Brazil, several different cultures and backgrounds, but by and large, one language. South Africa, very complex, very large, big populations, north of 60 million now. 10 or 11 official languages, probably 8 or 9, predominantly, strongly spoken languages, widely spoken languages around the country. High levels of complexity over a very large geography, very different histories, and very different cultures having to figure out life cheek by jowl together. And so I think in a place like South Africa, if you cut it across these dimensions of size, social complexity, diversity, and so on, we are absolutely a sort of prime classic candidate for a much more decentralized political structure. Now, either that sits within a unitary state that devolves power, significantly down to the local level, and therefore sits in a kind of Swiss sense as quite a weak central authority. Really just plays this kind of oversight role, has a council of leaders, and really tries to devolve as much as possible down to sort of canton or local level. So that's one way to have a decentralized system within a unitary order. And then what you would tend to get in a system like that is the idea of South Africa, the idea of a sort of very strong South African patriotism would probably start to dissipate. It wouldn't have to disappear, but it would probably dissipate towards a more regional, kind of regional cultural sort of set of affinities, but wouldn't have to disappear. So South Africa as a sort of idea could remain, and the people who live here could see that as some sort of broad geographic identifier, but nonetheless, you could have this very, very decentralized political order where you get a large degree of self-sorting between people who want to live in different ways and according to different customs and cultures and so on. And then, of course, beyond that, you start getting into the realm of things like secession, things like actual breakups where you form new unitary states at smaller scale, in ways that to varying degrees might start to approximate what we think of as the nation state. In other words, the nation or the group of people that identifies as a particular nation or ethnic group starts to then appropriate to move towards actually having their own state. We might think of Croatia as something approximating a nation state, or Slovenia, or Portugal. Portugal is a nation state. South Africa is not a nation state. It's a sort of civil government presiding over what was basically a colonial territory made up of very many different groups. And so I think that would be the distinction between a state and a nation state. To the extent that you think there are such things as nations and as peoples and cultures, and that's people differ on that, but I think we can get into that today perhaps, but I think that that's fairly self-evident. I think that there are different people groups. I don't think they're exclusive. I don't think they have to be rigid. I think those definitions are fluid. They always are. And I think those groups interact with one another to varying degrees based on all sorts of complex factors. So these are the sorts of real complexities that South Africa faces. I don't think that some sort of breakup into multiple states, multiple sovereign territories is necessarily realistic, necessarily desirable. That can go very badly. And I would reject a sort of disorderly, chaotic breakup of South Africa. I think that would be a potentially awful outcome. I think South Africans need to be thinking really hard about what's gone wrong in the last 100 years or so since union, what's gone wrong in the last 25 years, 27 years since 1994. And really, for the first time, start thinking about actually trying a properly decentralized political system. I don't think the ANC are going to relinquish that. And therefore, we've got to think of ways to start decentralizing South Africa kind of de facto. And that's maybe some other topics we can get into in the course of this chat.
Yeah, Russell, we had your colleague, Martin van Staden, who's a legal scholar, on the podcast. And he was saying quite similarly to you that we could actually, because of the breakup of the state in terms of the administrative state and its declining capacity, we could see federalism coming essentially through the back door, that this pressure ends up, that many communities, for example, in the Western Cape, decide that, they're not going to sit on their hands and tolerate the breakdown of, for example, energy infrastructure or other aspects, other critical areas in which the state must deliver, and that they essentially start from the bottom up, building these capabilities. But I just wanted to touch on this idea of cultural communities that you spoke about. And you mentioned a couple of examples from the former Yugoslavia. And I think that that's a cautionary example of how things can go quite badly. And you can have balkanization. That's the etymology of that term, comes from that region, where you have ethnicities and kind of ethnic nationalism basically driving people apart and driving them to conflict. So how do you avoid that? I understand that people can self-sought. If, for example, you're an Indian person and you want to live in Chatsworth with your community, there's something quite positive about that. If you come from the rural Eastern Cape and you identify with a particular set of cultural and linguistic traditions that you strongly identify with. But how do we prevent a kind of downside scenario where you have this disorderly breakup of South Africa and people starting to violently compete for resources or advantage or political dominance, that creates all sorts of negative downsides?
Look, I mean, you're asking the absolutely critical question of how to solve this sort of complexity. So there's no easy answer to this, but I would sort of challenge some of the inherent premises, embedded in your question. Where do we see currently the highest degree of conflict and political, let's call it unsettledness, as it were, in the former Yugoslavia? It's not in Slovenia. It's not in Croatia. It's in Bosnia Herzegovina. It's in Serbia and their relations with Kosovo. It's in the countries where you have a dominant ethnic majority, which imposes a particular cultural zeitgeist or flavor on the country. It imposes a particular linguistic atmosphere, particular cultural atmosphere on the country. That's natural, by the way. That's not a bad thing. That's what cultures do. That's what the Bosniak Muslims, who make up, I think, roughly 50% of Bosnia and Herzegovina. That's how they operate. But the conflict points, Dave, are still in the countries that have not sorted out their kind of cultural self-determination issues. And for me, I find that very fascinating. So yes, you had very short conflict for a place like Slovenia. I think there was about a 6-day war in 1992 or somewhere around there. And since then, it's been an absolutely peaceful, placid, prosperous place. Okay. Now, there's lots you can say about that, but go and compare that to the multi-ethnic states that haven't figured out the solution yet. And this is also a caution as to the limits of federalism, because you've got Republika Srpska in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which is a predominantly Serbian area, which I think has long had this desire to secede and join Serbia. What they arranged for Republika Srpska was a tremendous degree of autonomy, more than most federal systems allow. So it's almost being governed as this sort of quasi-Serbian state within the broader Bosnian Herzegovina polity. But that's actually not been enough. And what they've experienced is ongoing attempts by the Bosniak majority to kind of impose a particular national order, a particular cultural kind of order and national political structure upon them. And so you've got these recurring grievances in these sorts of regions. If we bring this to South Africa, I have no doubt that the post-94 era has been an improvement, a tremendous improvement on the political, operating software of the pre-94 era. I mean, that's inarguable. And the degree to which that has calmed animosities and calmed tensions between South Africa's population groups is, I think, largely inarguable. But it's not as though we live in a multicultural, peaceful utopia here, Dave. We have tremendous levels of violence and increasingly tremendous levels of racial political agitation. We know right now that we live under enormous volume of race-based laws in South Africa, something that you and I oppose, something that the Institute of Race Relations strongly opposes, and many other civil society organizations. So the multicultural unitary order, in my estimation, is not lending itself to peace and stability. And as I said, the KwaZulu-Natal riots of July were a manifestation of a tremendously deep level of social dysfunction that clearly the present order, the present unitary order is not successfully mediating. I mean, literally no police showed up, at this particular set of events for a few days. And then after the fact, they kind of arrived. So I would say that if we're talking about peaceful relations, I mean, it's true that certain kinds of hard secessionist, nationalist breakup can degenerate into terrible violence, terrible jingoism, and kind of violent nationalism. And history has shown us that this can certainly happen. But history has also shown us, Dave, that communities can self-sort. They can create fairly formal political structures and maybe even states that approximate the nation, that approximate the nation state, as it were. And that actually creates a platform for tremendous peace. And then they can interact with the other cultural communities on a diplomatic basis, on a very cordial basis. And that's also a way to generate peace, stability, and order. So political separation of any kind, it doesn't have to be secession. It can be significant devolution of many functions to the local level, including revenue raising functions, and all kinds of I mean, there's really a whole spectrum of political, let's call it technology, that could be brought to bear on any of these solutions. There's a range of options, and South Africa is a unique place. I mean, everywhere in the world's unique. South Africa has its own set of problems, its own geography, its own people, its own history, its own institutional sort of legacy. And so it finds itself in a place where it needs to, South African leaders, the South African political system, I think, really needs to think much more carefully about the kinds of solutions that are going to generate lasting peace and stability and genuine goodwill between South Africa's people groups. I don't think forcing rapid cultural kind of integration and assimilation in a very sort of modern multiculturalist sense, in a sort of multicultural cosmopolitan sense, is a sustainable model for the entire country. I think you're going to get certain areas of the country, cities, Johannesburg, Cape Town, these big inherently cosmopolitan cities. And cosmopolitanism, I think, can thrive in those places. And I think that's a good thing. I think there's a great space for cosmopolitanism, but that's not going to be the model necessarily for Zululand. And that's not necessarily going to be the model for the Karoo and for these other places. And that's also okay. And so I talk about in the way we think about these structures as something approximating a diversity of diversities. That some political organization in this, I mean, certainly in the major cities, it's absolutely unavoidable that you have and will have a multicultural, cosmopolitan flavor and makeup to those political systems. And then there's other parts of the country that are going to be very distinctively cultural. And I think that if we can figure out a way for that diversity of diversities, as it were, to coexist and to kind of interact on a peaceful, orderly basis, and allow for this real significant decentralization of governance and to some degree of sovereignty, whether we call that final result South Africa, whether we call it, a federation of South African states, whether we call it, whatever we call that result, as long as it's delivering what it needs to deliver, which is flourishing, peace, good relationships between individuals, but also with, between communities. And that allows South Africa's cultural communities to really self-determine in the way that they want, including in their own languages. I think it would be a real tragedy if some of these beautiful South African languages are lost to the internationalization of South Africa and to the kind of anglicization, the hyper-anglicization that we're seeing in many other parts of the world. So, that might come across a little vague. There's a lot of complexity beneath what I've just said there. But these are the sorts of ways I think we need to be thinking about order in South Africa. Because South Africa, Dave, to sort of wrap this whole question up and to take it to the start of what you asked, South Africa is, to my mind right now, an incredibly disorderly place. And I think it's on its way rapidly to becoming more and more disorderly. And I think these elections that we've just been through probably usher us into an even more disorderly era. And I hope that creates the urgency for us to actually expand our minds, not close our minds, but expand our minds on political options in the next era, as it were.
So, Russell, the great promise of 1994 was essentially one of an individual rights framework, freedom to associate with whoever you choose, freedom of speech, freedom of belief, freedom of expression, to articulate your view of the world and to kind of choose the direction of your life. And so that individual rights framework has been assaulted essentially by the rampant racial nationalism and a lot of the socialist policies of the ANC. And perhaps the CODESA negotiations, many of the participants, they were somewhat naive about the extent of the power of ANC ideology to centralize and command and control kind of philosophy, and to basically impose its will on the rest of society. But nevertheless, that dream of the kind of the rainbow nation, if you will, I think is something worth aspiring towards. So how do we reconcile these ideas of cultural communities that you've discussed and laid out with an individual rights framework? Because it seems to me important that we avoid a kind of a cultural essentialism or a racial essentialism, just because you look a certain way and that you're born into a certain community, that these are now the beliefs that you have to have. These are the ways that you ought to behave. So how do we reconcile those two ideas and that tension?
Yeah, this is again an excellent and difficult question, and I echo the last bit of your question there. I mean, getting into racial essentialism, genetic essentialism, all this kind of stuff is a complete no-go. That's the ditch on the other side of the road. So if there's a ditch on one side of the road that says that there's no differences between people, we're all just kind of potential blank slates that will assimilate into this kind of amorphous new liberal democratic man, because there's some conceptions of multiculturalism that actually see and desire a sort of full homogenization of man, so that we all ultimately assimilate into the same culture. We end up looking the same. We end up talking the same language. There's a single global sort of culture or universal kind of culture. So I think that there's significant problems with that, not least of which is I just don't think that's how humans behave. I think humans are inherently cultural. I think they have an inherent affinity to their place, their people, their culture, their language, their history. That's not rigid. Doesn't have to be essentialist. That's fluid. It's interactive with other cultures. That's all true, but that's a very realistic picture of the human condition, is that we are contextual beings. We're not just floating out of context, born into a state, as it were. We're born into families. We're born into communities. We're born into cultures. The first thing children know is not the state, is not the social contract, is not the political order. the first thing they know is their kin, their culture, their customs. So I think there's a ditch on that side of the road. The ditch on the other side of the road is turning that, as you say very eloquently there, Dave, is turning that essentialist, is having some sort of racial, genetic, skin color tests or requirements. These are, that's the path of some of history's greatest mistakes and follies and tragedies. So, there's an absolute ditch on that side of the road. I did a thread on Twitter recently about English South Africans and how I think that English South Africans form a distinct cultural community. It doesn't mean it's rigid. It doesn't mean it's narrow. It's quite a broad, actually, it's quite a broad cultural community. And I got the usual sort of people saying that I'm arguing for some sort of white essentialist, idea. And the simplest way to rebut that is to say, if you know anyone, and there's many other ways that this can be true, but if you know anyone, any white English people who've adopted Black children, those children are being raised in English society. They're being raised in English culture, South African English culture. Now they will have a complex identity, and that's cool. That's fine. But of course, anyone can assimilate into a culture. There were white Zulus. There's been many white Zulus in South Africa's history, or maybe not many, but several. Well-known British settlers who assimilated into Zulu culture, became chiefs and became white Zulus. So, racial essentialism, agreed, completely out and must be rejected. I think the issue that we're going for here, Dave, is the ability to self-sort in various ways and in natural ways that people are drawn to. Cultural communities are a reality. If I say to you, if I ask you to picture an Indian South African and an Afrikaner, you're going to develop a picture in your mind of two different people. They live in different places. They do different things. They have different cultural reference points. They speak different languages. They probably got different religions. They're different people, and they're part of communities that are quite different. Now, at the core of each of those communities, people are very different. So someone who finds themselves at the core of Zulu culture is very different from someone finds it incredibly difficult to relate to someone who finds themselves at the core of English culture, the core of Afrikaner culture. These are the sorts of people who barely speak another language. They speak their own language. They're very fixed to their own customs. And then you get people on the edges of those cultures, Dave, who are the people that build bridges. They're the people who congregate in the cosmopolitan areas in towns and cities. They're the Zulus who can speak perfect English. They're the Afrikaners who can speak perfect English, or the English people who can speak great Afrikaans or Zulu, or whatever other languages one talks about. These are the people that interact in cities. They build bridges. They're the cosmopolitan portions of those societies. They intermarry with other cultures much more. But at the core of those cultures, people tend to marry within those cultures, and they tend to cultivate life within those cultures. So that's all a way of saying that I think we are first and foremost, to varying degrees, creatures of our cultural context. That doesn't mean that context is fixed or immutable or inescapable. But it's real and it's attractive to most people. Most people want to stay within their cultural contexts and cultivate a life within those cultural contexts and be relevant in the hierarchies of those cultures. So that's one of the markers of understanding, which culture you find affinity towards is within which culture and within which cultural institutions do you aspire to have status? Do you aspire to climb up in the hierarchy? in the Zulu kingdom, there's a particular hierarchy in the Zulu kingdom, and Zulu people and certain Zulu people have a tremendous aspiration to have status and hierarchy within that particular context. And the rest of South Africa doesn't really have that. An Afrikaner living in the Karoo doesn't aspire to achieve status in that particular hierarchy. So that for me is the kind of one very broad brushstroke way of starting to talk about the reality of different cultures. To get to your question, I think that, and this goes back to the broader concept I wanted to get across at the top of the discussion, which is that in the same way, Dave, that the state isn't the whole of the social order, the state isn't the whole of what it means to protect and defend individual rights. Individual rights, they need real mechanisms of protection and enforcement. And in the same way that an overbearing unitary state loses control over its ability to govern, to create order, I think it loses its control to actually protect individual rights. And again, I think we're seeing that in South Africa with the awful violations of people's rights in many ways and in many levels, the violation of people's safety, the tremendous violence against that we see against women in this country and women and children. These are instances in which the state, whatever it says in its constitution, has actually simply lost the ability to actuate and to actualize in the real world. And my contention would be that cultural communities or communities of any kind, I mean, yes, cultural is one such local smaller community, but you could have different kinds of communities that don't necessarily see themselves along cultural or racial or ethnic or those sorts of lines, but lower level mechanisms of order. That's actually where you see the sort of instantiation and the defense of what we call individual rights. So the state has some role to play in that, but if you require it to play too much, it actually can't play it. So I think that it's in the development of strong local institutions, many of which will find themselves centered around common culture. Okay, that's just how humans organize. So they don't have to be centered in that way, but many institutions of order express themselves in a kind of cultural context. But even if they don't, it's those mechanisms of order that I argue are where the actual defense of rights emerges from. In reality, in a real society, on the ground, day to day, communities defending weaker people within their community from predation, from crime, and all these sorts of things. And I just don't think that the state making some theoretical contract with the individual is sufficient to actually protect that individual. I think here's the state and here's the individual, and within that you have what the American conservatives of the 20th century called these mediating institutions, these intermediate non-state cultural and community institutions that actually protect and defend individual rights and liberties. So I think that's really critical to sort of starting to solve this potential conundrum. There's one last little point here, and a lot of liberals point this out, and they say, well, if you don't have the state as the sort of final arbiter of those interactions, you can get tyrannical communities. You can get a community that doesn't uphold and defend individual liberties. It might be very collectivist. It might oppress people in a certain way. And those people might find themselves trapped within that context, and they need a state to come and rescue them. this takes us down a much deeper and more complex discussion. So I suppose, want to introduce it more than necessarily explore it. I think it's something that could be explored, another time. But I think it approximates something like the complexity of America going into Afghanistan to make it a liberal democratic order that respects individual rights. It's very, very difficult. It's very difficult to go into a cultural context and really impose liberal individualism on a community that doesn't necessarily have the cultural and moral wherewithal in their history to kind of cope with that and to facilitate that. Okay. So there's a real tension here between a kind of universalist liberal conception of the rights of the individual, and then realizing that actually in reality you have to kind of outsource that protection of individual rights in reality to these local non-state structures and institutions of order. And then having to deal with the fact that some of those are not going to protect individual rights or uphold individual rights in quite the same way as the liberal universalist conception of them would have it. And then how do you mediate that moral kind of conflict between the states and the community? And if you want to go in and impose that liberal individualistic kind of structure, are you doing other damage that local cultural community can't cope with, or is going to do great harm for it in the long run? These are very, very delicate questions. And it's one of the reasons why conservative philosophy and theory is far more cautious of going into local community context and meddling and trying to impose an order that might look good from the outside, but once you impose it on that very complex local context, doesn't necessarily play out quite how you thought it would, and creates all kinds of other tensions within that society. So that's a real issue, but it's one that I think has to be explored a lot. I think that the main point here for me is non-state institutions are critical to the protection of individual rights in reality.
Now, Russell, as Mark Oppenheimer argued in a recent episode of my podcast, the price of freedom is constant vigilance, and it really requires individuals and communities to guard against infringements on their rights. And you can't simply outsource that to the state. But the classical liberal conception of the state is also this night watchman state, the minimal state, that focuses on a few key areas: maintaining law and order and the rule of law, protecting the sovereignty of the state itself from external threats. And surely the problem is just that the state is, as we started in this conversation, gotten too big. It's gotten too involved in the affairs of individuals. It's been captured by a rapacious elite, which is very ideologically motivated. Now we're seeing the hegemony of this dominant political party, the ANC, starting to break down. And these last elections, I think, were a very telling example of that. And we're also seeing, in parallel to that, the rise of a lot more pluralism in our political space. There's a lot of small interest parties, local interest parties. There's a fracturing of the opposition, but it's also grown in aggregate terms. So surely, this is the process of the democratic maturity that's underway, and removing that dominant group from the levers of power of the state, introducing much more kind of pluralistic, coalition-driven kind of model of governance that might be able to better express the very heterogeneous interests that exist in South Africa.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I think broadly your observation is correct in the sense that I think that the structure we have now in South Africa is just simply unsustainable. It doesn't jive and mesh with the social realities on the ground. And I suppose that's another important concept for people to try and take away from this is you can have a political structure, and then you've got a social reality. And the degree to which those are misaligned, you're just going to have unease, unsettledness, conflict, political tension and volatility until that structure aligns with the reality of the society that you're in. So that's what South Africa is going through. The transition from the apartheid regime to the democratic constitutional order in 1994 to 96 was a way to start doing that. And I think people need to see that transition as in some respects very progressive, in the sense of creating real progress towards doing this, towards creating this alignment. But unfortunately not going far enough. And having elements within it that actually start to maybe perpetuate a pulling apart again of the political structure and the social reality. So if we criticize the present order, the straw man is to say, well, we're somehow harking for previous apartheid era sort of stuff. I mean, no. The issue is, how do we now get the political order so that it matches the social reality? That's the next challenge we have, and it's everyone's challenge. It's not just the challenge of Afrikaners or English South Africans or white South Africans or Indian South Africans. It's the challenge of all South African communities to be starting to think in this direction. So I think as you rightly say, I think through the electoral process that's starting to happen. Now, I think the electoral process is a very inefficient, very slow, and very kind of low traction way to achieve this, but it's a way, and it's a way that this is starting to express itself. I think, you spoke about the classical liberal conception of the night watchman, small state, and of course, me, Dave, I'm very, very much in line with small government. But the real question is, how is it that governments are allowed to grow? Because any bureaucracy, any government institution has a tendency to grow. I mean, this is just a simple fact of history. Governments grow, and when do they stop? They stop when they hit real opposition, not when they hit sort of de jure textual opposition in some written constitution, or some judge rules against them in some particular matter, and so on. I mean, those are very temporary and sort of toothless ways in which state power and sort of elite power is checked. And as many historical sort of political realists have noted, the only thing that ultimately checks power is power. And so what do we mean by that? In a South African context, in any kind of state context right now, I think what you've seen is the loss of alternative centers of power. In the old Greek classical literature on the Republic, the idea was that you had several real centers of power. You had a demos, you had a democracy, but you also had a kind of aristocracy. You had a landowning class, and it wasn't a one man, one vote system. It was a system of real balanced powers. I think what the sort of liberal conception of the state then tried to do, and you see this in the American Constitution, was take that good idea. We all recognize that power should be diffuse. When it's concentrated in a few hands, no matter who they are, right wing, left wing, capitalist, socialist, it ends badly generally. So we want diffuse power, and so what we did is we wrote a kind of synthetic separation of powers into our constitutional orders. So we will have courts, and we will have a legislature, and we will have these sorts of things. And I just think that those, depending on the social reality that you face, those are quite weak at actually constraining the growth of the state and actually allowing real alternative centers of power to develop. So I think what South Africa has to do is, by all means, vote different parties in and create electoral illegitimacy for the government. No question. I think that has political power and purchase at some level. I think it's a slow process, and I think it's an imperfect process, but it's a process. But I think at a much more fundamental level is communities, again, in South Africa, whether it's cultural or other, need to start building real institutions, getting real funding, and starting to actually build alternative centers of power. Now, that's not of some kind of sovereign authority where you then will go and attack the government in some sort of civil war. That is creating oppositional, real, actionable opposition, not just political party electoral opposition, but real in day-to-day life opposition to various state policies and directives. And yes, that includes the ability to start engaging in civil disobedience for manifestly unjust and destructive laws. We have a rule in South Africa that says you can't produce energy beyond a certain level and sell it into the grid without all kinds of permissions and without all kinds of things. And you're basically we're barred essentially from producing energy for ourselves. Okay, and to my mind, that's intolerable. That's unjust, and but if you're going to disobey that, okay, you need real power. You need the ability to disobey that and not have the arms of the state come and smash that down and close that down. Okay, so you've got to actually start creating kind of real power opposition. Okay, it's subversive, but it can also be done in a very legitimate way, and in a way that follows tried and tested principles of what we would call constitutionalism, drawing on ancient principles of law, and actually opposing unjust state laws in that way. So I think people have to be thinking about that in addition to the electoral stuff. Dave, the electoral stuff that you cite is certainly nice to see. It was great to see the ANC going very, very low in the Western Cape and getting sort of rejected in large parts of the country. But it's going to take, I think, a lot more than that, particularly if the ANC starts to go rogue and actually, disobey the electoral mandates that are given by the electorate. That is a risk that I think we have to plan for that scenario. And continue to build alternative mechanisms of order and centers of real power.
Russell Lamberti, thank you very much for joining me on Solutions with David Ansara.
Thanks, Dave.
If you enjoyed this conversation and you're watching on YouTube, please do leave a like and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so already. And if you're listening on your preferred podcast platform, please do subscribe there as well and leave a 5-star review. That really helps the show to grow. My name is David Ansara. Until next week, take care.